Good morning. This is Cyber Protection Magazine, and we're here with our second roundtable. And today the topic is going to be IoT security and what the state of IoT security is. And well, IoT, we will see a lot more of IoT in the future. IoT, Internet of Things, is basically can be webcams or connected cams, connected cars, vending machines even, but also routers. Everything which is sort of smaller than a regular computer. And there are predictions that even today we have something like 20 billion IoT devices, but we've also heard a lot about security weaknesses of IoT devices. And so today I have 4 industry experts with me to discuss what the state of IoT security is. And I have with me Christine Schönig, Regional Director, Security Engineering from Checkpoint Software. Also Marko Yehoshua from Scadafence, VP Global Marketing. Marko Kirschner from Armis, who's the Senior Director, Solution Architecture in EMEA. And finally, Marsden, the Chief Technical Officer of Eseye. And yeah, I would suggest let's get the discussion starting. So if we look at IoT devices and IoT security, what would you say is the current state of IoT security? Christine.
Excellent question. I think if you currently take a look into the news and especially the latest challenges in the IoT environment, you see plenty of examples. So overall, the state, let's be a little bit positive, can be better. Let's be realistic. I think it's a topic which is completely underestimated, and the overall situation is IoT devices are as such are certainly seen as the next big topic to get into an environment, to get into a customer network, to get a business disruption. And of course, companies as well as users like you and me, or all of us in this round here right now, should take security and IoT devices seriously, because there's a huge gap, especially from those vendors who provide the service and offerings.
Okay, thanks. That was a good introduction. Ian, would you agree, or would you like to add something?
Yeah, well, I would agree completely actually with Christine on that. I think it feels like most of the testing on IoT focuses on the functional testing, as in what's it meant to do, and not necessarily all of the testing around, okay, what could happen during the life cycle of this product, etc. And therefore, a lot of the designers or whatever pass that responsibility often off to the service providers like ourselves, etc., to almost provide a layer of security around the insecure device that they are internally having. I mean, on a positive note, I mean, we are seeing changes coming through on this, so it is something that is definitely hitting the radar of more customers now.
More customers, Marko. How much would we see in the future on IoT devices and on security of the IoT devices?
Well, I mean, there are lots of predictions out there, from Gartner and all of the, big firms predicting 25 billion, I think, by this year, and then going all the way up to 50 billion. I think it all starts also with, what do we consider as an IoT device, right? I mean, there's like the view, anything which is not considered a generic purpose system, but connected and, physically connected somewhere and, being able to communicate. Is that considered the IoT, let's say IoT scope, which definitely will increase the number even more, starting from devices which, we see typically coming from the consumer side, entering the enterprise side, digital assistants, all of these things. So I think we're going to see even more devices, and obviously, if there's a rush to market, as we see also, I think unfortunately the security is somewhat lacking, when it comes to these new features and new products entering our enterprises.
rush to the market and the lack of integrated security. I think that's a good point when we talk about the state of IoT security. Michael, we've seen some data breaches all connected with IoT security. What's your experience?
So I can speak a little bit more on the industrial side, but first of all, not to take away from the brilliant points brought up by Christine, Marko, and Ian. I can tell you that on the industrial side, many times that those parts of the network were closed off to the internet, and now they're starting to add more IoT devices in the networks for the sake of productivity. And the issue is with the world's approach to IoT devices, where innovation is the main priority and security takes a backseat, right? You know what they say, the S in IoT stands for security, right? So yeah, we do see that happening. And of course, there are these like really funny stories of, you know, an attacker who broke into a casino by hacking the smart thermostat on the fish tank. And we are starting to see more and more of these. And like Marko mentioned, right, Gartner says there's going to be 25 billion of those IoT devices. The numbers are continuing to grow, and it's a mess out there.
Okay, you mentioned the attack on the fish tank, which you know, I heard similar stories on where a vending machine was attacked. But besides those sort of IoT devices which are somewhere in the network and can be attacked, what are other important attack vectors when we talk about IoT security? Marko, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it all starts with knowing what you have, right? I mean, that's the basics, the foundation. You know, what do you actually have to defend against or from? So if you look at, you know, what are the different attack vectors? Obviously, the fish tank, you know, it's a prime example. I think they were after the high rollers details, you know, back at the casino for that particular one, which was quite interesting. But the details for also the additional problems we actually see arising there is these systems, once they're being compromised, for example, being misused. Like if you look at Mirai back in the days, you know, as a botnet, where these systems, once they are compromised, are being used to cause havoc, you know, in other areas. So I think, you know, all of these additional scenarios ranging from, let's say, the cellular, you know, security. I think Ian can talk more about that area definitely, but the traditional connectivity over IP, Wi-Fi. So all of these angles, you know, attackers are creative when it comes to misuse any resources they can get their hands on, I think.
Yeah, and sorry, just butting. I think it's important to note. I mean, a lot of those today, a lot of the threats we see are not necessarily somebody trying to attack the device, and the fish tank is a classic example. It's actually trying to use the device to access something else, and therefore the problem with some of these devices being designed is that they fall into the category of going, you know, what's the worst that can happen to my device? Well, actually, that's not the risk. The risk is the fact that actually you then compromise the rest of the network or other things that obviously have a much bigger value or bigger concern. But back to your question on attack vectors, we also have to often look at attack, you know, how people gain access to these things, because a lot of IoT devices are also in unmanaged locations, and therefore, you know, the first rule of these things is often the physicality access, which can also provide compromise to devices. And if you're talking about cellular, you then start having to check out on things like the SMS planes and even, you know, voice access or whatever. There are other protocols that also provide access and often are used as backdoors for configuration maintenance for valid reasons, but often are overlooked when it comes to, you know, security testing, penetration testing, etc. So all of these are relevant vectors that need to be considered.
Yeah, the physical access, that's actually an interesting point, because as you said, a lot of devices, or quite a few devices, are probably in unmanaged locations. But does it make sense for an attacker to actually be on site to be able to attack?
Well, it's interesting because I mean, a lot of IoT networks, etc., actually run as effectively a global private network, and therefore potentially, if you can compromise one device, you end up with a trusted status within that network. And there are news articles about advertising screens being hacked from another advertising screen, because then they are effectively they end up on the same network. They might be across a city completely, but because you can compromise one, you can compromise the other. I mean, obviously, and then that comes down to the network design to make sure that you don't allow device access, and obviously monitor and secure that. And the movement of things like 5G or etc. actually change some of those network architectures to more IP based, and therefore again you need to consider that with the newer technologies, to making sure that you don't add new attack vectors that you weren't aware of. So yeah, the physical, I mean, most devices have the ability to firmware update them locally, and the danger is that you can therefore bootstrap it back into a completely non-functional state, but still fundamentally has privileged access back onto the network. So it's almost like a Trojan horse at that point. So there's interesting attacks that can come from that route.
Michael, you were the one with the fish tank example. So would you agree with the analysis of Ian?
Yes, 100%. From what we see, IoT devices, they have like a huge management challenge. Like Ian mentioned, and like we mentioned earlier, many of them don't have enterprise policy and management in mind, in their design, and they weren't intended to be centrally managed. So they also use proprietary management interfaces, which are either human readable, or they have an API that uses like per device development, and it's hard to manage them, and this ultimately causes the IT departments difficulties to keep track of all the devices to the network, whether they are dispersed locally or even if they're nearby. They can't control their policy, and it's hard to keep them secure. And some of the attack vectors that we see, especially in our industry, are old, weak, or default passwords, right? There was a story on Shodan of a lot of devices which were vulnerable, but also they have out-of-date firmware with critical CVEs, insecure configurations, like Marko mentioned, lack of monitoring for malicious activity and anomalous behavior, right? Just, if you can't see them, you don't know about them. If you're not monitoring them, it's hard to understand. And also if there are violations of internal policies or external regulations, all of these, cause trouble for IoT devices.
So yeah, older IoT devices, and I know that there's a lot of IoT devices which sort of have been upgraded to be actually connected, but are essentially from somewhere from the last century even.
Call to home functions to China.
Exactly, yeah. Christina, how much of a problem are these old sort of weakly secured devices in an enterprise environment?
Most of them even got forgotten, Patrick. So the situation is, to just summarize what those gentlemen already said before. The situation is IoT devices grow in the network. Visibility is one of the key criteria. And first of all, you should know what you should focus on and what you should actually consider with your security policy. But even more than that, it's not only those old devices, I think Ian just said it, those devices were actually manufactured to do something else, to improve a business process, to help the customer getting a competitive advantage. So security is not, let's say, the key point. But if you take a look at the device, OT as well as IT networks, they're pretty close to each other. So if you work with a weak entry point to your network, all of a sudden, it's not a security risk in the IoT arena. It is actually security risk in the complete IT infrastructure the customer might face. So talking about security of those devices in general, we can talk about the operating system challenges. We can talk about the physical security. But the most important topic is to talk about the summary, the connectivity, a kind of risk assessment. What do I have? Where do I have it? How can I actually protect it? What about network segmentation? How can I make sure that even if something happens, that something is not actually spreading in my network? So overall risk assessment is of course one of the topics, whether those devices are old or fairly new, one of the most important topics customers should definitely start with.
But risk assessment, I would say, would probably start with, that was already mentioned, knowing actually what your devices are and where they are. How can you do that if there's, I can imagine, I don't know, maybe if we take the Colonial Pipeline as an example, I mean, they probably have a geographically wide network of sensors, and some of them might actually be forgotten. Isn't it awfully difficult to actually do a counting of all of these devices first?
There's one important sentence, I guess, we as Checkpoint, as well as our technology partner, especially in the IoT environment, focus on: you can only protect what you see. So absolutely, if you don't see those devices, you can't protect them. So starting that risk assessment, there are so many tools in place where you can start taking a look at your network segment. All of a sudden, you start looking at IP addresses, you're looking at protocols. You need to identify devices. And of course, those gentlemen here, when it comes down to identification, they know it even better based on the business industry. You work with different kind of IoT devices. They all got a unique signature to identify them on. And based on that, you need to start getting your visibility into your environment and of course into your network.
Okay, and then once we actually have the visibility of all devices, Marko, what could be a next step to do a proper risk assessment and then eventually secure those devices?
I just want to add on what Christina said. I mean, having, as I've spoken to many customers and many larger and smaller networks, I think that challenge is everywhere. Like, not just knowing what do I have, how many, where are these systems. I don't want to use the buzzword shadow IT and all of these things, but all of that is actually playing into the same picture, saying, what do I have? And again, finding that one, I think, is that's the starting point. They say the first step to actually then further, evaluate the risk. Like, to come to the question is, what is the next step? Like, once we have, let's say, our customer has a complete visibility on what do they have, and that means any kind of network which is interconnected. We mentioned it already here, like we see a convergence between the OT world and the IT world. If we talk about the water treatment plant attack in Florida, right, there was a clear example where IT was pretty much the entry point, so to speak, and it affected the OT, which then affected the physical world, or potentially could have affected the physical world. So we actually have to look at all of these things. Now, once again, the details of what we have as a connected environment are available, then obviously the next steps are, what is the behavior of these systems, we talked about the misuse of these devices in, a different purpose or a different attack vector, for example. So are they communicating as they are expected to be communicated? Do we identify old operating system, old versions? I mean, just look at the IP camera world. Like there are so many different cameras. They're popping up 3 or 4 different cameras every week. At least it feels like that. Again, we're coming back to the rush. We're coming back to what are the TCP/IP stacks that are used. Like most of these systems, they go like a building block system. Okay, I need, let's say, an operating system. I need a TCP/IP stack. They actually build these things together, slap an API on top and the UI, and off you go with the product with all of the inherent risks and problems of these building blocks. So having pretty much that deep visibility to later on saying, okay, what is actually running on these things once we have identified and how do they behave, that actually then leads to being able to assess the risk, saying, okay, do we need to have segmentation? Lots of people talk about micro segmentation, these kind of things. Do I need to put all of my cameras in one area, my PLCs, for example, into a different area of the network?
Exactly. And if I can add to that, sorry, Patrick, for stealing your thunder. Many times what we see from the customer side is they tell us how many devices they have. They either run it on an Excel or they have some sort of asset management. And then when they call us in and we do the assessment and we actually see what's in their system, they actually see that they have, about 3,000 devices, which they didn't even account for. And 200 of those are even connected to the internet. So like you mentioned, Marko, and like you mentioned, Christine, sometimes people think they have visibility into their network, but they actually have a bunch of devices that they didn't even know about. And that can be an entry point for attackers, because these are accounted for. But ultimately, once you have the understanding of what you have, you learn about which devices are communicating with whom, right? You can learn about which protocols are being used. Are they using, protocols which are unsafe, like SMB version 1, for instance? You also learn about the network subnets, right? Like Marko mentioned about segmentation. Are we putting our devices in a safe place? If there are parts of the network that are managed by third-party vendors or other users, are we giving them access to the whole network or just to their segment? And then once you have all that understanding, then you can, monitor for anomalies like, many companies do today, and then see if there's anything strange that's happening to make sure that no one's getting attacked.
Now, the visibility, let's go into the visibility a bit more, because there's one thing where we have sort of older devices which have never been designed to be connected in the first place, but now they are being connected. But on the other hand, we heard the predictions. We know the predictions that there are a lot more devices coming up, and one of the technologies which is enabling IoT in a sort of broader way is 5G. Now, 5G is also, as I understand it, focused a little bit more on IP technologies compared to the earlier mobile networks. But more importantly, companies will be able to set up their own mobile network. Wouldn't that increase the attack vectors just because there are just so many more IoT devices? And also, isn't there a danger that those will be forgotten, so to speak? Ian, what do you think?
Well, I think there's kind of two different pieces there. I mean, obviously the increase in the number of devices obviously provides more scope for threat, more permutations in there. And I just want to pick up on one point on the previous thing is, of course, the other problem we have in IoT is that devices last a long time. That you have devices installed for a very long time, and that's not necessarily, therefore by definition, security threats become more relevant, firmware updates become more relevant, and we have lots of devices on our network that are 10 years plus. And that is a different challenge to managing IT, where obsolescence and management makes those ability to manage it much quicker. But that aside, back to the 5G discussion. Obviously 5G, mainly really with the movement to LTE and then 5G, obviously there's more focus on IP, giving more capacity, more scale, lower latency, etc. But and those are more complicated networks. I think there is an absolute issue with those networks becoming more readily available as sort of out of the box, so private LTE installations, etc., where ultimately you end up with networks that historically have been managed by large teams of experts who understand what they are, to becoming deployed on your local gas station, and at that point, who is actually managing? Who's even making sure that the configuration of that network to start with is secure, let alone over the lifetime of threats, etc. And I think that's a real obviously risk with 5G coming out, and particularly private networks in that space. Luckily it's not quite here yet, so we'll see how that unfolds, but it is a risk that people need to be aware of when they see the opportunity, I suppose, of deploying those private networks, if they do it without understanding that they are complicated beasts to set up.
That's actually a brilliant point, because if we look a little bit beyond IoT, but we see in the general IT industry, we see a shift towards the cloud on the one hand. On the other hand, we have that development which you just described, that companies with 5G are able to set up their own networks. And one of the reasons why the shift to the cloud is actually going on is because a lot of companies don't have the resources anymore to handle those complex networks. But is that other development that companies have their own 5G networks, they have more IoT devices, sometimes thousands of them, isn't that sort of contradicting the shift towards the cloud?
It is, and I think you'll see that will probably shake out, that although you might end up running a local network, it would still be centrally managed by service providers, because otherwise you get this risk. But it's worth saying, I mean, there's kind of two, there's products that are inherently unsecure or badly designed, and then there's products that are arguably could be secure, but the person setting it up didn't know how to make it secure. And that's kind of where I was coming to on the network side, but it's equally valid for the device. You know, most of the compromises on, you know, cameras or whatever are because somebody hasn't changed the default password. You know, is that the fault of the vendor? Maybe, but clearly it's the fault of the person deploying it.
But this is another good point, and something we wanted to discuss anyway, is how can we enforce security even by design on those devices, and would that be enough to stop some of the attacks? Christina, what do you think?
I'm not quite sure if you can really enforce it by design in general, because there will be companies who adopt to it. There will be companies who do it maybe a little bit better than others. But in general, something we actually run into quite often is customers are looking for an appropriate recommendation, a kind of best practice, a kind of what would we as a security vendor recommend our customers to do. Of course, I feel much more secure if I know I'm dealing with a device which has got a certain security standard. But talking about thousands of devices, you talk about different kind of vendors, and of course, consolidation comes certainly to the table as well. So overall, I think what we should actually aiming for is, on the one hand side, I mean, getting those IoT devices connected means that you have a business advantage, and you don't want to interrupt that business advantage just because security is playing an even more important role than what you aim for. This is never going to happen. This is not the purpose why we're all dealing with IoT in general. So overall, getting back, I think what we should have is a mix of both. A certain kind of security assessment come along with the device. If I go and purchase one of those cameras and then I put it on the network, there is not a single sign telling me once I power it up, change your password immediately, or it's somewhere on a sticker. It actually is built in, and if you want to look into it, and maybe this is going to change, and some vendors have already adopted, but if you're looking into the setup as such, you're focused to get your camera on the internet and do something fancy with it, but you're not focused on, first of all, change the default password. And most of the people don't even know changing the default ports. So it comes with, I think, a certain responsibility within those IoT vendors making recommendations. And at the same time, it also comes whenever we are getting more and more professional, it comes with a kind of blueprint, a kind of recommendation. There are certifications already in place when we start talking about recommendation, best practices, companies or recommendations like NIST certifications, like all those things, they all need to play together, because you can never take one of those IoT devices and look at it as a single point of failure. And of course, I mean, seriously, it has to become much, much more easy. It's the average people who deal with an IoT device who should know what they do, because every now and then they might even be part of an attack without knowing it. We've seen it with the Mirai botnet. All of a sudden, TVs, toasters, fridges have participated in a denial of service attack without people even knowing. So all those things actually come together, and there's definitely a lot of work to do. Out of the vendor perspective, those companies who produce the IoT hardware, of course, but at the same time, also some recommendations. And I think we as those who represent the customers at the same time, our companies basically, we also need to come up with a much, much better recommendation how to deal with these kind of challenges.
Recommendation is one thing, but I can also imagine if we just take the example of a camera which does not have a default password, but maybe something on a sticker which is different for each camera. You know, that would probably pose some issues when implementing devices, because companies, I mean, me as a private person, I might buy 1 or 2 cameras, so it's not an issue to change the default or to log on with different passwords which are printed on a sticker. But a company which has maybe 3,000 cameras at once, how can they implement that if they have a different password for every single camera? I mean, how can an implementation be made easy in that sense? Michael, maybe. What are your experience on that?
Well, there are workarounds, and of course there are solutions who do something like this, where you can change the password for 1,000 devices with 1 click. But then again, I'm not here trying to sell any products, but these solutions do exist, and these things were come to mind because of customer requests. But yeah, that's that's a tough question to answer. But yeah.
Marko, what do you think? Maybe.
I mean, certainly what Michael already said, right? We need to make it easier, or Christina said it as well. We need to make it easy to actually have these security features, by default enabled and easy accessed, and people wanting them to configure them. I mean, there are certain areas where you can actually have a workflow, like when you onboard a camera, like you onboard an employee, like you actually go for best practices, security training, these kind of things. Now, if you look at the, let's say, enterprise grade, when if you talk about consumer grade or enterprise grade devices, right? Consumer grade, you probably have 3, 4. I mean, I have some colleagues, they have 20 cameras at home. That's fine, right? They want to make everything secure. But then if you go, let's say, into enterprise world, you typically talk about thousands of cameras. And then typically you look for solutions, or say for vendors who actually have these kind of capabilities, where you actually onboard, a camera, it phones home to the central system, and then, you centrally manage these kind of things. But also coming back to what Christina said, like where we actually see the vendors, so the manufacturers of these devices, a little bit, more in charge, or not in charge, but they actually have to adhere to these new requirements, so to speak. Now, if you look at things like the Internet of Secure Things Alliances, right, where you can actually see people signing up, who generate or who produce these devices, and then they have this pledge, for example, where they say, okay, you must not do these passwords, security by default, these kind of things. So that, I think, is the right direction, for the development. But then also coming back to what was said earlier, these devices may be in the network for 10+ years. So even whatever we do right now, right, in order to improve the future generation of devices or connectivity, what about these devices which we implemented last week, which still going to be there the next 5 or 6 years? So it's like, looking forward, we have to get better, in everybody, let's say the consumer of the product, the manufacturer, but also the security industry. But also we must not forget what we would call legacy devices, in 1 or 2 years time, to actually keep securing those devices as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the main challenges, right, with IoT, because on one hand you have devices which were never designed to be connected. Then you have devices which have been designed to be connected, but because they have been produced, I don't know, 5, 6, 2 years ago. They're not really secure in that sense. But then you have the ongoing initiatives like the IoT or Secure IoT Alliance you mentioned, but also I think the European Union has something at least in the works to enforce security of those devices. That must be an immense challenge also for securing the devices. How would you go about that, Ian?
Well, I think it's worth identifying. We've touched on the difference between what is effectively a consumer grade and an enterprise grade product, and obviously a product can fall into both categories on that. But I think, I mean, there are well-known standards and security algorithms, etc., that deal with the enterprise grade, because we've been dealing with enterprise network security for a long time, and I suppose the aim is to make sure that IoT manufacturers, the devices have the capabilities to be managed in that way, and then secondly is the fact that they understand why it's important for those products to have those security and management features and protocols built in, and then really just also making sure that I suppose in a way that the people buying those products understand why they want those levels, because you know, back to the camera as a good example is, you know, the person who's deploying 1,000 needs to almost be putting on the RFP, I need this to be a centrally managed camera estate, and it needs to conform to these standards, because that's where I deal with my security risk of my estate. And until the purchasing department understands what they're trying to buy at a security level, it's hard to ripple that all the way back down through the vendors and everything else. So I think it's a progression, and it's, in a way, everybody needs to grow up. A simple way of saying it.
Okay. Maybe on that progression you mentioned, you know, sort of a progression in the way that IoT security is seen, and I think that a lot of companies probably don't, at least yet, have IoT security on their agenda. Coming back a little bit to the initial question, what is the state of IoT security? So, you know, if you compare that to a product lifecycle, in what phase are we? Are we still in a sort of early adopter phase, or are we going into more mainstream phase? Christine, what do you think?
I'm afraid, and maybe I'm a little bit too less optimistic here, but I'm afraid that we are still in the early adopter phase, because the topic as such gets underestimated. It's like, well, it's just a camera, it's just an IP address. What are people supposed to do? But it's not, as we just said, it's not the camera, it's the IP address and where you get from there. I mean, if you currently, one of the gentlemen already said, take a look at Shodan. It is massive. I mean, you can take Shodan as for the good as well as the bad. Is it a hacking tool, or is it the Google search of the IoT devices? If I use it without a lot of technical background, and if I currently see what's happening there, this is not only for data privacy reasons, it is in general a massive pool of information, and it shows in all different kind of varieties, we're not taking it seriously enough. So again, I think we are in the early adopter phase, and there's a lot of work to do in general, in combination with IT networks, in combination with where is actually the potential I see. As I said, is it, you know, just a service disruption because I take an IP address, I take a look what the camera is able to show me, and I might enjoy it or not. Maybe I take this IP address and I start walking through the network. Where do I get from there? Maybe it's not an IP address of a camera, but it's an IP address of a steel mill. And all of a sudden I'm able to access the web interface, and all of a sudden I'm able to start doing some modifications and not only cause a business disruption, but also cause a huge cost effect to the company I'm currently, well, trying to not deal the appropriate way because they forgot to basically protect this IP address of the steel mill. You name it. There's so much potential in there. And I think people might see the IP address, but they do not see how this all connects together. And this is where the huge cyber threats are actually coming from.
Now, if we're still in an early adopter phase, wouldn't that mean from the other side, so the cyber criminal side, that they can still go for the sort of low-hanging fruits instead of having to resort to sort of highly sophisticated attacks? Michael, what's your experience?
So yes, and I actually have a very interesting story to add on of what Christine was saying. It's not, I mean, yes, and they are still considered early adopters because IoT, you know, devices and technology are continuing to adopt. There's always a new one. There's always a new device. There's always something new, and the vulnerabilities and all the other stuff, they continue to grow. But something very interesting happened. This, of course, didn't hit the news because it wasn't an attack that was publicized because we stopped it. But what happened was a customer who was completely air-gapped, by the way, they're not even connected to the internet, and they started buying certain IoT devices for production within their system. Now, these IoT devices had malware embedded in them from the manufacturer. So either they were manufactured with malware, or the malware was sitting at this manufacturer's site. And when they bought all these new devices, what they did was they started putting those devices in a network where they had security or visibility. And all of a sudden they started seeing a lot of, Christmas lights popping up, on their dashboard. And they started seeing that something was wrong. And they're like, wait a second, these are brand new devices. They're not even connected to the internet. How is this even possible? And then they were able to confidently say that all of these devices were embedded with malware. They ended up, first of all, cleaning their network, sending everything back. But yeah, cyber attackers are very creative, and just like technology, they will always find a new way. And with IoT, there is still that low-hanging fruit, and Marko can probably talk about this for hours. But yeah, this is definitely something that we're seeing.
Yeah, let's maybe, I think we discussed a lot of different aspects from IoT security. But if we say that we're in an early adapter phase right now, maybe to sort of as a closing question for each one of you, where will IoT security be in, say, 2 to 5 years? And Marko, we'll start with you.
In 2 to 5 years, well, I hope in a much better place. To start very open with that one. I mean, you mentioned it already. We do see a couple of, legislative things coming in. Eseye, they released a nice report, and recommendations. We see in the UK a couple of laws coming in. One thing which we have seen, if people, let's say, they don't see a pain or they're not forced to do something, it's hard for people to, get them to adopt new things or secure things at that point, for example. So if there actually is an incentive, because there are regulations, frameworks which they have to follow. So that is my hope, that we see more, not necessarily regulations, but frameworks, best practices being adopted, and that everybody then from the purchasing department, as someone mentioned, like saying enforcing these kind of requirements all the way down to the person actually creating that device. Again, Internet of Secure Things alliances. So I hope that we actually see a lot more of these things being adopted, and then obviously also as an end user perspective, the understanding that, as Christine mentioned, it's not about that device, not about that come up, but what you can do and what the damage could potentially be. So the awareness side. So pretty much a little bit more pressure, force, so to speak, from the lawmakers, so to speak, that the companies who actually build these things see the light as well, and then obviously that the users actually implement it, also actually want to have these things secured.
Okay, thanks. Ian, what's your take on the future of IoT?
Well, I think I mentioned it earlier. I think first up, 2 to 5 years in IoT is actually not very long. So the problem that we're installing today will still exist, and therefore it's something that we'll still be talking about. I'm absolutely sure. I think there is a movement of just publicly visibility of risks, etc. I think products will be getting better, and there's more work around the standardization on those pieces which will come. I think there'll be more requirements, certainly from enterprise grade, for requirement on visibility and control around managing those estates from a security point of view. So I think that will become more standard. I actually I'm still pretty pessimistic about the consumer end, because I think consumers often, through ignorance, don't necessarily understand what security is, and therefore I think there will still be a huge body of risky devices out there, but hopefully they won't necessarily be on the enterprise side.
Christine, do you agree that consumer will be a little bit behind in terms of security compared to sort of enterprise security? Absolutely.
As long as it is still a topic you need to discuss and consider separately, as long as it's built in and people don't even know that they already deal with a secured device, make it invisible, just make it happen. I mean, nobody's asking what kind of seatbelt you have in the car, and you actually don't choose your car based on the seatbelt, but it's there. Law enforcement is forcing you to wear it, and it protects you whatever happens. So with that, certainly I totally agree with Ian. The approach on the consumer side is you have to make it automatic, otherwise this is not going to happen. On the enterprise side, I think there are also a lot of manufacturers who need to take their role and their responsibility. There's one thing: whenever customers go into the cloud, it has to go automatic. It has to go as without saying, not doing a kind of business interruption in general. And I think this is what we also need on the IoT side. So automation is extremely important, talking about profiling, talking about a setup where customers also got machine learning mechanisms around them. Like, this is the device, this is the purpose of the device, therefore I take the profile and put it into a dedicated security rule. So once we start talking about a certain amount of devices, or a certain let's say business environment, when there are hundreds of IP IoT addresses to be secured, this is when automation comes to play. And I think this is also when security vendors, we have to play our part in it. Make it more easy, make it more transparent, and not a business disruption, but make it basically secure.
So more automation, easier security, so to speak. Michael, do you see the same thing for the future?
I'm actually a little bit more pessimistic. I know that, IoT devices are mainly popular because they're very cheap, and people will continue purchasing things based on budgets, depending on the organizational's economic stature. And I don't know how they were hit by the pandemic. They're probably going to continue buying things like cameras, printers, or even, industrial IoT devices. But they're going to buy, they're going to buy ones that are either affordable or within their budget. And I still see that the numbers of IoT devices are going to be growing, like Gartner mentioned, and the number of attacks will also grow significantly. But on the positive side, there will be more awareness to IoT security due to more board and C-suite interest because of growing evidence of real IoT threats. So based on that, I think in the future, they're going to start bringing in the regulations. I know that the US government was trying in 2020 and even earlier, and they just weren't able to get anything done because there wasn't sufficient incentive for the industry to align around a single set of standards. And they tried doing standards for secure development, for identity management, for patching, for configuration management, and even that was a very big difficulty because the devices are so different, they're so dispersed, and there's just so many different kinds. And even if they do have this regulation, like Christine mentioned, it's like the seatbelt. But a seatbelt, although it's a great security feature, it doesn't prevent car accidents because car accidents come in many different ways. So even though there is this regulation, it's a very good direction, but it's only the first step. Because sometimes we see this, that people who follow regulations have this false sense of security. What do you mean? I'm 100% compliant with NIST, and oh, boom, cyber attack. So it's a very good step in the right direction, but don't have a false sense of security. So for the next 2 years, I still think that it's going to be a growing problem, but down the line, I do think that it's going to, because of the awareness that it's going to have, I do think that it's going to be a little bit more organized.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, we talked about the IoT security and sort of concluded that it's still in an early stage, but not everything is lost, and customers should start being aware of all their IoT devices, making risk assessment as a sort of first step to protect IoT security, and then find a vendor which can make the security more easy and more automated. I think that sort of sums it up. And yeah, thanks to everyone, first of all. And I know we could probably talk hours on IoT security. I think it's a very interesting topic, and then if you even divide further into consumer grade IoT devices, customer or company grade or enterprise grade IoT devices, and so far we haven't even gone into some of the details, such as sensors and battery powered IoT devices. So it's a very complex topic. Thanks, everyone. Again, this was Cyber Protection Magazine with a roundtable on the state of IoT security. Thanks, everyone.